trying to make sure that we recognize our leaders. That's going to be in the DNA of the Observer. Historically, that is what we've done. We try our best to acknowledge and recognize them. So this is the special edition, or shots from the special edition that we did on Mrs. Canson when she passed in April of 2003. A burning desire to see justice and equality for African Americans and for all people of color was the impetus that forged a small-town girl from Oklahoma named Verna Mae Dobson Canson to become one of the most distinguished civil rights leaders on the West Coast during the turbulent 1960s and 1970s. Many label her as Mother of Civil Rights in the West.
Mother of Civil Rights, Mrs. Verna Canson. Yeah, in the West. She was an icon for us. It was a pleasure to know her. Verna was a mother of the civil rights movement in the West Coast, it's no question. Because I didn't care who you were, how big you were, how small you were even with her.
This is one of the magazines or booklets that I have. Black women makers of history, a portrait. And Verna Canson's right here at the top. The article showing Verna Canson as the regional director, and it said that she was a black heroine freedom fighter. She was a tough-minded, no-nonsense type. She spent a number of years in dealing in power with people who wield power, mixing charm and brilliance of mind in her work. She has generated enthusiasm and support even in people who were avowed bigots before meeting her. So she was able to walk into a group or walk into a crowd and win them over.
You know, she was so unique. She was a unicorn. She was able to disarm people by her absolute wonderful nature.
I have several questions. Possibly you can answer them briefly. The first question is...
If you make them briefly.
But then to know that she was such a strong fighter for justice and equity.
When racism triumphs, it's not a victory for anybody. Well, oh boy. I'll have to go all the way back, I suppose. Well, first, my parents were teachers. They were always persons who were committed to public service, assumed responsibilities of leadership. My father became president of the Oklahoma Association of Colored Teachers. At that time, they were called colored teachers. In those days, it was legally segregated. I don't think they made a special effort to insulate us from the reality of these things. But somehow it never penetrated our psyche. In other words, it never came through that there was something wrong with us. What came through was that people who mistreat other people, there's something wrong with them. And they are the persons that you have to try to help and educate. So they decided that Tuskegee was a good place for me to go to college. I had had 2 years at Tuskegee and stayed on the honor roll, and I was majoring in home economics of all things. I used to work in the library at Tuskegee in what we call the Department of Records and Research. My job was to clip out accounts of lynchings. That, I think, had an impact. I met Clarence at Tuskegee in 1937, and he had grown up in Sacramento. So we did, in fact, get married on August the 7th, 1940, at a little ceremony there in Lima, Oklahoma, and we left the next day coming to California.
When she arrived in Sacramento, Mrs. Canson said she was appalled at the institution of racism that existed in the capital city.
It was a cultural shock for me. I didn't see any symbols for black people. There were no teachers. There were no policemen.
Well, Sacramento had a lot of overt discrimination. It was nothing to see a sign in a restaurant or a business establishment, no colored trade solicited. There were no restaurants downtown owned by whites that would serve a black. Hotels didn't cater to blacks.
I at one point used to say I didn't know whether I wanted my children to even go to high school in California. So I started volunteering with the NAACP chapter as a youth advisor.
Being the mother of civil rights for the West, I know Verna started out that way, and she kept it up. She kept the youth involved and encouraged us, and she always included youth in everything that she did.
So one thing led to another. I moved into the credit union, managed the credit union for almost 13 years. When I took it, the assets were about $39,000. When I left, it was almost $400,000.
To build the assets of it by more than 10 times, that's something very significant. She recognized the importance of economic empowerment as being a pathway to freedom.
And in fact, she helped some of our young people get their first account.
In the South, there's a different type of a fight for the NAACP, right? And it was necessary. But when we talk about on the West, where there was so much of a migration of folks, we needed a different type of leader. You needed a different type of person who could, again, get into these places and spaces where we weren't, to talk about financial empowerment, to talk about employment and workforce development.
I did work in trying to help blacks get employed. Safeway hired the first black. The John Bruner Company hired the first black. Campbell Soup Company, which was anti-union, we hired the first black.
Some things just need a woman's touch, and she was providing that, but at the same time doing it with so much effectiveness. There were not many opportunities for African Americans on the employment side in Sacramento, and the housing was definitely segregated.
One of your first housing cases took place here, where they had 2 buildings on the far west end of the project set aside for blacks, and the court declared segregation in public housing unconstitutional. So Sacramento became one of the meccas of civil rights in the whole state.
Well, the New Helvetia case really was the first major decision of its kind in the United States in the realm of public housing. So VIRNA CANSON found at least 3 tenants that would be willing to become plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the city of Sacramento and the Sacramento Housing Authority to move forward in terms of the type of integration that the NAACP desired to happen. Nathaniel Cawley established the first African American law practice in Sacramento. He was also prominent by way of an injunction that he was able to get against the Sacramento Public Housing Authority. But the timeline that VIRNA CANSON developed gives us a real clear picture of the sequence of events that occurred that are part of history now. In fact, that timeline was used as the basis for an article in the NAACP's national magazine, The Crisis, to show how that particular struggle in Sacramento was effective in overturning segregated housing in Sacramento, and also how it was one of the first, if not the first, struggle of its kind to do so in the United States. One of the spectacular things about all of this, in terms of looking at it in historic hindsight, is the fact that VIRNA CANSON typewrote everything, all the activities of the Committee Against Segregation in Public Housing, and the fact that we were able to still have these as part of the public record shows you the importance of what VIRNA CANSON did. VIRNA CANSON cannot be separated from Nathaniel Cawley. Nathaniel Cawley cannot be separated from VIRNA CANSON in terms of the level of expertise both brought to the table, and the successes they had a profound impact on civil rights, not only in California, but throughout the entire western United States on behalf of the NAACP.
This is VIRNA CANSON's house, and this is an application for the National Register of Historic Places. My name's Alyssa Marie Garcia. I am a public history graduate student at Sac State University. And VIRNA CANSON's house came to me through fate, sort of. It's by accident. It was assigned to me in the Cultural Resource Management class. There was a project that Sacramento City was actually working on called the African American Experience Project. And so our class was recruited essentially to work on it as researchers. And so as I started really doing the work behind it, I realized the magnitude of who I was researching. So what stuck out to me was really that VIRNA CANSON extended her convictions and activism not only outside her home, but in her home, and even right in her backyard. In 1960, VIRNA CANSON built an apartment complex in their backyard. It was an 8-unit apartment complex, and VIRNA advertised that as no racial restrictions, and she was very deliberate in that.
That's putting faith into action. You know, she's using words to help drive action. So say no racial restrictions is specifically talking to hey black folks, here's an opportunity.
Building that apartment building behind her house is just amazing. I never heard of anyone doing that. I know we build an in-law apartment, but not 8-unit apartment building for people who could not find housing. What she's saying there is anyone can live here. You know, it doesn't matter what race you are, what your level of income is, because we are here to help people get a fair shot. And she had to be the one to give them the fair shot.
Mrs. Canson later worked for the regional office of the NAACP, directing the legislative efforts for the powerful association. During that time, she became California's most influential civil rights leader.
So that I then went to work, and the first thing was to save the fair housing law. The governor has campaigned that his first act would be to eliminate the Rumford Fair Housing Law.
Do you still believe in the right to discriminate in the sale of houses?
I happen to believe very deeply that the right of the individual to the control and disposition of his own property is one of the very bases of individual freedom.
She was right there with Reagan, making sure that the Fair Housing Act was handled correctly, and I don't think he was listening, but she kept going to him, going to his staff.
And we worked very hard to get Reagan to agree to go around in the communities and listen to the people and back away somewhat on his rabid, opposition to the law. And we won it.
The people who hold the highest office in this state have no real concern about the problems that we face.
Every statement about fair housing psychologically says you're no damn good, you're no damn good. Something has to give way, and maybe personal property has to, I don't know.
Governor, earlier this year you came out for repeal of California's open housing law, but now you've reversed it. Why?
I must say, in the climate of today and since these meetings, I have changed my mind only to the extent that I would prefer now to modify and make the necessary changes within the framework of the existing legislation.
Many times, VIRNA got people to reverse their stance on things because she had done the research.
VIRNA knew everybody that was anybody. And you got to know who the players are and what their politics are. And she knew that. When VIRNA backed a bill, you could almost rest assured it's going to pass.
In 1974, she succeeded the late Leonard H. Carter as the West Coast Regional Director for the NAACP. As director, she became a tireless campaigner for the rights of all the western United States, including Alaska and Hawaii.
Ms. Canson, as West Coast Regional Director of the NAACP, is it your perception that racism is on the rise again in our society?
I think racism certainly is on the rise, or let me put it this way, the absence of the moral thrust that we witnessed, say, during the Kennedy years and the Johnson years, there's not that force there to offset what may be a latent kind of condition in this country.
VIRNA Canson's ability to be this moral compass, right? She spoke on that video very clearly about the absence of it, particularly at a time, late 70s, early 80s, the emergence and challenges for affirmative action, equal opportunity.
The capitulation of the city structure and the community itself to racism, that one perhaps is the more serious one, because it does in fact impact on each and every citizen. When racism triumphs, it's not a victory for anybody.
The challenge for this nation, and she articulated it, is like how Dr. King talked about white silence and the absence of those that are in places and spaces where we are not, to be able to speak up on behalf of what is morally correct.
And there's the absence of that kind of moral thrust, that kind of caring, to some degree sympathy, other degrees understanding. The mask is off.
I'd like to introduce the some. Thank you. And present to others my leader.
VIRNA Canson, regional director. Let's give Verna a hand. She's got. Come on up, Verna.
What the kinds of changes we want to see internally or externally, you do. The discussion can start right at your brain's level, or it can start at this level, and then put it in the pipeline and set it all up.
Verna was a strong leader. She kept her branches in tight. And that's a good title for her, the mother of the civil rights movement in the West, because she was known from Pocatello, Idaho, to wherever.
We have now 5 area conferences, 5 state conferences. California is one, Arizona is one, Alaska, Japan, and Hawaii. Where we have small constituencies, we combine the states, Nevada, Utah, and Idaho, Oregon, and Washington.
Verna didn't run around with a flag waving. She just did it. If it needed to be done, she did it.
VIRNA CANSON was one of the founders of ACSO, and so this is Afro-Academic, Cultural, Technological, and Scientific Olympics. VIRNA made sure the youth were taken care of, and when the ACSO program came along, that was more for the ones who are like in science, in music, drama, writing. She thought it was important that young people had some kind of activity where they would showcase their talents.
That's one of the greatest programs NAACP come up with. Verna got behind it. Sacramento has been fortunate enough every year to have participants. And you got some of the brightest minds in that ACSO program you ever want to meet.
Yeah, that's her preserving the archives of the NAACP history. Extremely important. She had the foresight to be able to put in place something that is going to live long past her. Capturing these artifacts of, the civil rights movement in the West Coast. It is preserving our history, recognizing that it is something that is going to be critical for future generations to find and have access to. That's an amazing accomplishment when you add that to the list of other things that she worked on.
To me, it was kind of hard to see that she was going to retire. What? You're going to stop doing all the things you've been doing? And but she wanted to spend some more time, I know, with her daughter and her grandchildren. And I remember some of the people who spoke at her retirement talking about how they came up because of her and what she had encouraged them to do.
Well, my relationship with Verna was very close. I could always call her any time of day or night and get some advice if I needed it. The NAACP to me was like a family. Those of us who's in leadership positions, you need to know who, how, and when. And she led me in the civil rights movement to where I am today.
Over the years, I've always had my video camera taking photos of our youth with adults. So I have lots of tapes of the young people participating in events like voter registration, voter education. And the final tape that I think one of Verna's last elections, I had the young people escort Verna into the voting area. She helped the youth councils, and now the youth are assisting her in voting at the end. And then she put on the little sticker that said, "I have voted," and put the stickers on the youth too. And so having her participate with the youth council at the end, brings it full circle.
Mrs. Canson's unshakable campaign for justice impacted the lives of millions of Californians. This special edition of The Observer pays tribute to the tremendous legacy of this tireless warrior and servant of social justice. Mrs. Canson's connection to The Observer started as early as the publication that we had in 1963, naming her the 1962 Woman of the Year, a piece that my own mother wrote. There was no question about us doing a special edition. No doubt that we were going to kind of pull her history together. It's for reasons like today, 20 years later, talking about the legacy of this person, where you don't have a lot of access to their history. Her story is told through the pages of the Observer from our inception to her passing. It was a great relationship, and it's why she was just so special to us.